But while you're finding Job in your Bibles, let me ask you, any of you ever had to go and see somebody knowing really, really full well that you're going to be in a lot of trouble when you get there? You had that feeling? Yes. Some of us know how that feels. You're going to see, I don't know, maybe a teacher at school, maybe a boss, maybe mum, David. You have to go and see mum when you've been in trouble and you know it's going to be bad. Maybe husband or wife, I don't know. Well, here's somebody who often comes along and joins us on a Sunday morning and shares things with us. Here's Sid. He's got something to share with us this morning. And because this is our Christmas dinner service, even Sid is getting in a festive mood, and he's got a Christmas message for us this morning. Sid was waiting to see the headmaster. Sid was in serious trouble. He was in more trouble than he had ever been before. You see, he'd been at school, and he'd been waiting with some of his friends, and some of his friends had said, do you know what, I bet you can't jump up and touch your head on the ceiling. Mandy's smart, she's thinking she's heard this story before somewhere. I don't know where she might have heard this story before. You can jump up, do you think you can touch your head on the ceiling? And his friends had a go, and none of them could quite get there. Sid thought, I'm not going to be the one who gets beaten by this challenge. I'm going to do this. So he crouched. And he got himself ready, and he paused, and he leapt with all his might up towards the ceiling. There was a bit of a thud, and he landed on the floor looking a little bit dazed. And as he laid there on the floor, feeling a little bit dazed, wondering what had just hit his head, his eyes started to clear, and he looked up and gradually came into focus what was now above him. There was a big hole in the ceiling. And then, if things couldn't have got any worse, suddenly another face appeared over him, looking down at him. It was one of his teachers. So now he'd been sent to wait outside the headmaster's office. He knew there was nothing he could say to defend himself. He knew that even if he could sort of try and defend himself a little bit, he was going to see the headmaster. And to know what, the headmaster is always right. He was never in the wrong. Sid was in the wrong. And as he stood there, his legs started to go a little bit weak. He knew that he was in trouble. Job chapter 9. And everybody else has now got their Bibles open at Job chapter 9. For some reason, mine's open at Nehemiah chapter 9. I've put my mark in the wrong place. Let me catch the rest. Here we go. Job chapter 9. Then Job replied, "Indeed, I know that this is true. How can a mortal be righteous before God? Though one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him one time out of 1,000. His wisdom is profound. His power is vast. Who has resisted him and come out unscathed? His wisdom, he moves mountains without their knowing it, and overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth from its place and makes pillars tremble. He speaks to the sun and it does not shine. He seals off the light of the stars. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He is the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. When he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. If he snatches away, who can stop him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? God does not restrain his anger. Even the cohorts of Rahab cowered at his feet. How then can I dispute with him? How can I find words to argue with him? Though I were innocent, I could not answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy. Even if I summoned him and he responded, I do not believe he would give me a hearing. He would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason. He would not let me regain my breath, but would overwhelm me with misery. If it is a matter of strength, he is mighty. If it is a matter of justice, who will summon him? Even if I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. If I were blameless, it would pronounce me guilty. Although I am blameless, I have no concern for myself. I despise my own life. It is all the same. That is why I say he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When a scourge brings sudden death, he mocks the despair of the innocent. When a land falls into the hand of the wicked, he blindfolds its judges. If it is not he, then who is it? My days are swifter than a runner. They fly away without a glimpse of joy. They skim past like boats of papyrus, like eagles swooping down on their prey. If I say, I will forget my complaint, I will change my expression and smile, I still dread all my sufferings, for I know you will not hold me innocent, since I am already found guilty. Why should I struggle in vain? Even if I washed myself with soap and my hands with washing soda, you would plunge me into a slime pit so that even my clothes would detest me. He is not a man like me that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. Only there was someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand on us both. Someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. Just like Sid, Job was in trouble. For those who don't know the background to Job, he was a very wealthy man. He had a big family, he had many servants, he had huge amounts of livestock. He worshipped God, he sought to please God. But Satan came along and said to God, that Job, he only loves you because of what you give him. It's covered love, God. Take away all the stuff you've given him, and Job will curse you to your face. And in one day, Job lost almost all his material possessions. His land was invaded, his livestock was carried away by raiders, even his children were killed. He remained faithful to God. Even his own wife said to him, she said, Job, just curse God and die, but he didn't. He did, however, go into a period of wondering what had happened. Why all this calamity had come upon him? He wanted to see God face to face. He wanted to ask him why these bad things had happened, when all he'd ever wanted to do was to please God. And in chapter 9, we hear Job thinking through a big problem. He says, I want to see God and ask him why all this has happened, but I know that God is awesome and scary, and that I actually have no right to stand and accuse God. And as he thinks through these things, we'll follow him and see what he has to say to us. But see also what all this has got to do with Sid, still waiting outside the headmaster's office. And what it might have to do with Christmas. Job wanted to see God. He wanted to ask those burning questions about apparent injustice, why things were so wrong. But he was a bit like Sid, waiting there to see the headmaster. Sid knew that the headmaster was a scary man. As soon as he stood before him, he wouldn't be able to speak. His knees would start knocking, his mouth would dry up. He wouldn't be able to say anything in his defense. And Job knew that God wasn't like any human. Verse 2, how can a mortal be righteous before God? Righteous means in the right, particularly in a right relationship with God. But the emphasis here is on being in the right. How can any human be in the right before God when God himself is everything that is right? So the Bible describes God as holy. Holy means perfect in every way. No human can describe themselves as holy. Not even Mary Poppins. Even Mary Poppins is only practically perfect in every way. She's not. Watch the film closely and you'll see she's not perfect at all. She lies to children. You ever picked up on that? And she lies to their parents afterwards about the adventures they've been on. She's a liar. She's terrible. She is not perfect. Even Mary Poppins. God is always in the right. Always. Totally perfect. Totally holy. Verse 3, though one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him even one time out of 1,000. Like Sid before the teacher, going drying the throat and getting his words in a muddle. Job knew that is what he would be like before God. You cannot defend yourself against an accusation from one who is perfect. Verse 5 tells us God moves mountains. He can pick up a mountain and move it somewhere else. Wow. He is awesome in power. That's why I played that song before the service. Awesome in power and might, it said to us. That is the God who we worship. Awesome in power. Almighty in the truest sense of the word. If being able to move mountains isn't enough, look at verses 8 through to 10. He alone stretches out the heavens. Stretched out the heavens. You know, scientists only in the last few years have worked out that the heavens are still expanding. The universe is getting bigger. The nearest stars are getting slightly further away from us all the time. The Bible told us this all those years ago. God stretches out the heavens. He treads on the waves of the sea. Who else can walk on water? He is the maker of the Bear and Orion. Stars and their constellations, he made them. The Pleiades and the constellations of the south. He made every star that shines in this universe. And according to Genesis chapter 1, he made all of them just by speaking. That is the incredible power and might of our God. If there's any doubt as to whether Jesus is truly God, then these words tell us so much. Only God can walk on water. What did Jesus do? He walked on water. God made everything, it tells us. John chapter 1 tells us it was Jesus who made everything. Jesus and God are one and the same. God is the maker of all things, infinite in wisdom, infinite in his power and his might. No wonder Job was scared at the thought of facing him. No matter how unjustly he might have felt he'd been treated, he knew that he could not stand before God and bring those accusations. Job, as he dwells on who God is, and as he dwells on the nature of God, looks at himself as well. Job reminds us that God is absolutely holy, he is absolutely perfect, he is almighty in every way, and we are not. That is the best way of describing humanity. We're just not those things that God is. Verses 14 and 15. How can I dispute with him? How can I find the words to argue with him? Though I were innocent, I could not answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy. Job feels as though he's innocent. He looks at other people around in his society and at his time, and he thinks, well, I'm better than most of them, and that kind of makes me innocent. He looks at robbers and murderers and people who don't treat the poor as well as he does, and he thinks, well, I'm better than them. But he knows in his heart that actually, compared to God, he is not innocent. No matter how much better than the people around us we think we are, when we compare ourselves to God's holiness, when we look at ourselves by God's standards, we realise, no, we're not innocent. We're guilty. We fall so far short of what God wants for us. All he can do is plead with God for mercy. All we can do is seek mercy from God. Sid is waiting to see the head. He feels that he hasn't done any more wrong than anybody else. Everybody else was involved in this game as well. He was just better jumper than they were. They're not standing there waiting to see the head. He is. But deep down, deep in his heart, he knows he's done wrong. He did break the ceiling. He can't plead his innocence. All he can do is admit his guilt to the head and ask for mercy. Like Job in verse 20, Sid's own mouth must admit his guilt. And in fact, even though Job felt innocent compared to other people, he knows before God, actually his sin is like filth. Look at verse 30. Even if I washed myself with soap and my hands with washing soda, you would plunge me into a slime pit. No matter how much we clean ourselves up, no matter how much we pretend that our sin isn't there, before God, actually we are filthy in our sin. We look like we've crawled out of a slime pit to God. We cannot pretend to be innocent before God any more than Sid can pretend to be innocent before the head teacher. But as Sid stood, waiting to see the head, quaking, knowing that he was about to face this punishment, hoping that he might find some mercy in there, along came the prince. If you remember from previous stories, the prince is the one who came from the king to show us what the king really wants. He's the one who makes it possible for Sid to know the king and to be treated as a son of the king, just as he is. The prince came up to Sid as he waited outside the doors, and he asked Sid what was wrong. That was enough for Sid. He broke down and he sobbed. He told the prince all about the ceiling, how he was about to get into terrible trouble with the head teacher. Just wait here, said the prince. Let me go and see the head. Job realised what Sid realised in that moment. And they realised what we need to realise, is that what we need is a go-between, an arbitrator, somebody to talk on our behalf. Verse 33. Job, with this wonderful foresight and this eyes on what was going to come in years later. Verse 33, if only there was someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand upon us both, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. That's what Job pleads for. That's what Job wants. Like Job, we cannot stand before God and claim to be innocent. We're not innocent. By God's standards, we're guilty. Job cried out for somebody to stand between him and God and take God's anger away. Which brings us slap bang to what we're thinking about today, about Christmas. But you know, God sent that arbitrator. God sent that go-between to stand between us and God. God knew that we were guilty before him. God knew that we couldn't stand before him. God knew that in his holiness he would have to punish us, and so he sent somebody very special to stand as a go-between between us and make peace. And I hope we know that person was Jesus. We've already seen that Jesus was involved in creation, something that God alone did. He walked on water. So Jesus is part of God himself, yes, yet he's the God who became human. And he had to, in order to do this incredible job of standing between us and God the Father, he had to be God and he had to be human. Who could stand before God except somebody absolutely righteous and holy? Nobody could stand before God but part of God himself. Who could represent us except somebody who is one of us? Can't be a representative of humanity without being part of humanity. So Jesus had to be fully God and fully human, so that he was righteous enough to stand before God the Father, but one of us to be our representative. He came to be the one who would stand before God and plead on our behalf. Sid heard a voice, the headmaster's voice calling for him. Sidney! He knew he was in trouble when it was Sidney. Sidney! Come in. He went in. He was frightened. The prince had gone. He was sure he'd seen the prince go in the door. He'd disappeared somewhere. The prince was like that. The head looked at him. You've done wrong, Sid. Sid was scared. But the prince has spoken for you. He tells me that you belong to him now. He tells me that I am to treat you the same as I would treat him. And I know that the prince is perfect. And if I'm to treat you the same as the prince, and the prince is perfect, then I'm not going to hold your sin against you, Sid. Go and don't do it again. Sid was amazed. In that moment, it dawned on Sid what it really meant to be equal with the prince. Everyone who believed and followed the prince can have this feeling, he thought. Everybody who follows the prince can know what it is to be equal to him. To be treated as though you're perfect even though you're not. Job knew what the arbitrator he longed for could do. Verse 35. If he had this arbitrator, he said, then I would speak up without fear of him, without fear of God. If our trust and our faith is in Jesus Christ, the arbitrator that God sent for us, then we can approach God without fear. And you know what? He will treat us as he treats God the Son. He will treat us as being equal to God the Son. He will treat us as being innocent, even though we've sinned. Because God sent this arbitrator that Job pleaded for, we are able to stand before a holy God without fear. If our faith is in Jesus Christ for salvation. And it is all because of what Jesus has done for us.